Hello again everyone, I hope you're all keeping well. In this video I'm going to be talking about how socialism and communism are fatalistic ideologies. In the previous video I talked a little bit about how David Hume's ideas are able to break down entirely very flawed notions of inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, and fatalism as a worldview. Okay, and although it went over people's heads a little bit, I tried to make it as accessible as possible for everyone, but it is a complex subject matter, that particular area, right? Why that's necessary to know all of that is because socialism and communism, as I say, are built upon the ideals of determinism and fatalism. And people don't know that enough, to be honest with you, right? They are not familiar enough with that fact. And I'll show you how this is the case as this video proceeds. But before we get into that, let me also stress something else. There is a popular misconception in people's minds that I want to help them to dispel. And that is that communism preceded socialism. That is to say, it came before socialism. Some people think that. That is false. That is not true. Okay? In point of fact, what happened was, as a result of the French Revolution and the bloodletting which took place there following Robespierre's reign of terror, you have to understand that socialist thinkers like Francois Fourier and Babov began to educate another generation of students in their ideas. And those students included Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who are arguably the fathers of communism. Okay, so communism is not the parent ideology, right? Socialism is the parent ideology from which communism stems. Now, the reason why people believe the opposite of that is because of something quite fascinating, and that is to do with the way that history played out in regards to the Cold War. Because in America particularly, what happened was that the communist threat rose up first, and then the subversion of the American political stage happened with socialists and others flooding in to, as I say, change the landscape of America. Okay? So this is why people are under this misunderstood notion that, well, it's one of the reasons. There's actually probably many reasons why this is the case, but this is one of the reasons insofar as I've looked at why people believe that communism was first and foremost. And it's also possible that because communism came to be the bigger threat over time, just like we see with, for example, certain elements of Islamism, right? These Islamist ideologies that branched off from original ideas, they became the threat. And it's the same thing that we see even on a micro level, where with immigration, for example, and this is a touchy subject, it's not easy to talk about these things in the current climate, but you do find that second and third generation immigrants from Islamic backgrounds particularly find it very difficult to integrate, and so therefore they end up being the more serious threat than their forebears were. Okay, but anyway, be that as it may, getting back to socialism and communism, why do I say they are fatalistic? Okay, they're fatalistic because they presuppose, okay, they make an a priori assumption without any evidence, without any real tangible reasoning behind it, right? Like Hume explained, it's just an inductive leap that they've made, that you have group A, which could consist of, and they started off with class theory, right? So you've got the oppressed class, let's say the proletariat as they term them, okay? But this, by the way, one quick thing I will also say is this got mapped onto all kinds of other things like race and gender and so on, right? So Group A could, over time, when this sort of happened, Group A could now consist of not only the proletariat, but black people, women, certain ethnic minorities, Muslims, Jews, whatever else. And so it creates the schism, this dichotomy, for identity politics to flourish. Okay, so you've got Group A, as they put it, and these are the oppressed people. Then you've got Group B, and this consists of the people who wield power, let us say, supposedly according to the Marxist view, right? And this is in their way of looking at it, and I might be oversimplifying slightly here because it's a little bit more in depth than that. But let's say you've got the bourgeoisie, okay? So the rich upper classes, for example, class theory is where it started. Or you've got white men, okay? Or white men and women, right? But then it can be distilled because of this whole thing with feminism, which mapped class theory, class struggle onto its own ideology. It grafted it on, basically, because the purveyors of second wave feminism certainly were Marxists. I don't think that's deniable, right? And I've gone into depth in explaining how that was the case with the Chicago Women's Liberation Union and so on, right? Very, very important organizations to look at if you want to understand this. But as I say, broadly speaking, you would have the oppressor and the oppressed, okay? And the oppressor could be the patriarchy, it could be white men and women, it could be the bourgeoisie, the rich, the affluent. It could be anyone who is basically seen as the reason why Group A has not succeeded in whichever metric they want to measure it. Okay? So whether it's financial success, whether it's academic success, and so on. But it goes further than that. So you can already see the strains of fatalism there, where it's painting people into, is putting them into a particular category and saying they are that category, right? But it goes beyond that, because it then says that this schism, this dichotomy, will always remain as such. Okay? It will always remain as such. Right? As long as, certainly, as far as Marxist theory goes, as long as capitalism exists, right? So they hold to that. Do you see what I'm saying? Fatalism is dangerous for this reason. It's totalitarian for this reason, because it holds to the idea that these two things are always going to be in direct opposition. These groups are always going to be in direct opposition, and there will never be a time when the group that's classed as being oppressed will no longer be oppressed, except in the case where, and this is the interesting bit of how communism gets out of this little muddle that they create, what Marx created essentially, is to say that, well, that'll happen once communism trounces capitalism. Okay, once capitalism is ripped down or falls down of its own accord, as Marx put it, and that's another quick thing I have to say about this, is that didn't happen. So when capitalism didn't fail of its own accord, the Frankfurt School took it upon themselves to try and bring about the downfall of capitalist societies. Right? They wanted to they were basically sort of eschatologists, essentially. Right? It's a little bit like people who want to bring about the second coming of Christ. Okay? It's the same idea behind it. It's to bring about the end of the world, to bring that closer to them. Right? And that's what they did. Because they infiltrated through the Long March through the institutions that are, as a lot of people are familiar with, partly as a result of Gramsci's works, mostly, I would say, as a result of Adorno's work, and also Marcuse. You'll find that this infiltration into capitalist academies occurred in order to bring down those societies, okay, bring down those countries. Anyway, you'll be familiar with that part already. The point I'm making here is that the prophecy of Karl Marx did not come true. So they tried to make it come true. And even that didn't actually work. Okay? And the proof is in the pudding. If you look at the quality of life for people and measure that using any metric whatsoever, you'll notice that the quality of life for people has improved the world over, right? Not just in first world countries, but also in third world countries, okay? There's less and less poverty occurring every day, even though there is still poverty there. That doesn't negate poverty, it's just less of it all across the board. So capitalism has been responsible for that. It wasn't communism that solved those problems, right? But as I say, this belief in prophecy, okay, exists inside communism, exists inside socialism. The belief that one could accurately predict. And this is why I was telling people, look, you have to go and study Hume's work, or at least watch my video. Why? Because you have to understand that taking it as granted that there is such a thing as prophecy or fate usually is indicative of faulty or flawed thinking. Okay? You cannot prophesize based upon past experiences what might happen in the future. Just because a certain pattern emerges, it doesn't necessarily prove the pattern if the thing happens again, right? It's just that it might have been the norm in a particular time. Okay? What's my point with that? And again, I might not have put that in the best ways quite as well as I did in the first video, but what is my point on that? My point is this. That strain of fatalism carries over into all kinds of things, okay? It carries over into these faulty notions that communism would win the day, and it didn't. It failed. Everywhere it was implemented, it failed and it had disastrous results. There's never been a single successful communist country, ever. Okay? And that tells us something. It tells us that the system upon which they tried to base their political doctrines was faulty. It did not work. It could not work. Okay? But again, as I say, communists can't see that, right? Now, the problem is that because nobody out there is teaching people properly about David Hume's work or the classical philosophers that posited so many excellent ideas that actually should be taken up for consideration in today's times, because their work is not widely disseminated, and instead this nonsensical work of people like Marcuse and Adorno and some of the postmodernists even. But here's the thing, postmodernists had some interesting things to say. However, because of the socialist leanings of the academies, the interpretation that they have given to the postmodernists is one in which there is only, what might we call it? Well, it's destruction, right? They're proponents of destruction of Western capitalist countries, but also they are, they took deconstructionism to mean that they should only deconstruct the political and the social fabric of the countries in which they were in. They didn't realize deconstructionists had another point, okay? And I'll talk about that later on in other videos at some point, actually, because this is quite important. This is part of the reason why the dialogue between left and right has utterly failed. The true left and right I'm talking about, not this garbage nonsense that we've got today, okay? Because what passes for left and right today is nothing of the kind. Okay? All you've got are totalitarians trying to impose their own ideological worldviews on everyone else, especially in the political arena. Okay, but also in the academies, also in the schooling systems. And this is another criticism I have of the education system. They're not educating people properly at all. Okay, this is widely known. Of course you know that, right? It's not like you don't know that, right? They are not educating people properly. I don't just mean in terms of, they should be educating them about, let's say, civics or, the true classical liberal philosophies that came out of the Enlightenment, or mathematics and physics and all these kind of subject matters. I don't just mean that. I mean, they haven't really opened the minds of people to even their own purported ideas properly. Like, they've never really sat down and asked students to critique communism, for example. They've never sat down and asked students to critique socialism in a proper, thorough manner. Okay, that's, as far as I know, that hasn't happened. Okay, and they've never really taught postmodernist studies properly either. This is the most shocking thing, because if you read Derrida, or if you read Rousseau, okay, or if you read any of these weird thinkers, let's call them, and they are pretty weird thinkers, by the way, right? They weren't, Foucault even as well, right? Foucault had some brilliant ideas, but they don't even teach their work, right? Instead, it's all taught with a slant of Marxism, which is very, very dangerous to do, right? There's never really been a proper thought-out process of, well, which areas might certain notions of deconstructionism be useful? Okay? Is it possible that deconstructionism could be useful psychologically for people to break down all their own nonsensical programming that's given to them by their parents, by society, by educational establishments? Do you see what I'm saying? So deconstructionism can be very useful on an individual psychological level, as well as understanding language. Okay? Because yes, there are problems with language, and people like Foucault and Derrida understood this, right? Chomsky even has talked a little bit about language in a great many ways, which is actually fairly sensible. Okay? But they're not teaching any of those things, right? Instead, something dreadful has happened. Okay, and I want to finish on this point. There's much more I could say on all of this, by the way, because as I say, these ideologies, they're insidious because they are totalitarian, because they are eschatological. They propose there is such a thing as fate, and people are fated to be what they are, pretty much. That's the central fundamental problem I have, right? But getting back to the point I was making about the educational establishment as well, you see, it's not that the kids that are coming out of these academies are evil inherently, okay, these social justice warriors or whatever. That's not the case. And people need to stop thinking this is the case. There's something else going on here, okay? I think this is what's happening. People aren't being allowed to acknowledge that their life experiences mean something, okay, but that they mean something subjectively to them, okay? And there might be certain instances in which there is an aggregate feeling, let's call it, a pathology that emerges within certain groups, and they may therefore feel suppressed or oppressed, even though objectively this may not be the case when it's measured in any proper way, okay? So say, for example, with any given group of folks that the Marxists would claim are oppressed, they're not legally anymore. There might have been a time when that was the case, by the way. This is another thing, right? There might have been a time when that was the case. But it's not the case anymore. Not legislatively, not socially, mostly, right? This is not happening. But there is something happening to them. There's a pressure, a downward pressure upon these, and it's not just the case. See, older people, and this is a criticism I have of the boomer generation especially, and part of Generation X, and people get outraged when I say, well, Gen X was partly responsible. Not all of it, but a part of it was, because they clung to the ideas that were taught to them by the boomers. Okay, about a third of Generation X clung to these ideas, which were, really, really not healthy to hold to. But they just have this idea, the generation that benefited out of everything, that the young people that came out of the academies, that are coming out the academies, whether it's the millennials or Generation Z, that they are lazy buggers and everything is their fault and they are just horrible kids. Okay, this is Wrong. Okay, this is the wrong way to look at it, because it's not their bloody fault. I can't believe I have to keep saying this. Okay, if you teach a kid, because keep in mind, right, here's another thing, and not enough people grasp this. Human beings have to be socialized. Okay, nobody's born being a brilliant pianist. You might have the attributes that will make you a good pianist, say genetically. You might be predisposed to being artistic, okay? But you're not born a pianist. You're not born, being great at anything. You have to practice that thing, and that involves socialization, okay? So people are very much the result of socialization. Okay, now one big mistake people make, like there's all kinds of mistakes and we've outlined so many of them, but one massive mistake parents especially make, or older generations make, is to think that everything is down to somebody just inherently being bad. Okay, and I don't know where the hell this comes from, because it's nonsense. It's not true, okay? Nobody in the world is born bad. There are people that, here's the thing, there are really interesting studies in this. There are people who are born psychopaths or sociopaths that don't go out there killing people because they know it is wrong. Okay, they are the proof. Okay, because they have been socialized well. They are the proof that it's not inherent at birth. See, the ideas of Marxism and socialism are dangerous because they actually stem from a socially Darwinistic worldview, as bizarre as that might sound. There's much more in common that all these different worldviews have behind the scenes than people realize. Okay? The same views that were espoused by the eugenicists, by the real absolute racists, all these views that were there when horrible atrocities have happened in the history of the world, well, guess what? The Marxists and socialists believe in them too, right? It's just more of a softly approach. Okay, because the end goal of all of this isn't going to be communism or Marxism. You're going to see flat out social Darwinism rolled out across every area in which these people have massive amounts of control. Okay, but I don't want to get off track too much here. The point I'm making is that these kids that are coming out of the academies aren't the problem. Well, they are the problem, but they weren't born being the problem, okay? They were made to be the problem by a lack of good parenting. That's first, okay? That's the first problem. They were not parented properly. How many times have I said that? Okay? The second problem is that the academies and the schools and the whole of the educational establishment was teaching them badly. Why? Well, here's the thing. If you are feeling certain ways, but you don't know how to express that, okay, you don't have the necessary language skills, which is the case because the schools aren't teaching English properly anymore. You should look at the number of people that are falling out, dropping out of schools without basic language skills, without basic math skills. Okay, this is certainly the case in the UK, and I'm sure it's the case in the US as well. These kids can't express themselves properly. They have no tools with which to explain why they're angry about everything. Okay? Or why they're outraged by everything. Okay? Or why they want to rip everything down. They have no tools with which to do that, to explain their own frustrations. This is what's going on. So when you see these social justice warrior types out there acting nuts, it's because if you can't communicate to somebody what is going through your own head, as disturbed as it might be, okay, then there's no chance that you're ever going to be able to rectify that. You might know there's a problem, but you don't know how to explain there's a problem inside your own thinking, in your own head. Okay, that's what's going on with these kids. And it's happening with the adults as well. Right? They are not able to articulate properly why they are frustrated. Who is it that's doing the frustrating? Why do you feel a sense of pressure on you all the time? They might be surprised to realize if somebody really had come along and spoken to them and asked them properly, okay, in their earlier life. By the way, at certain points it just becomes too late. But if somebody had asked them at a certain point, why is it that you are angry? Why is it that you're frustrated? And had taught them the proper necessary language skills to communicate it, they might find that they have a heck of a lot more in common with people across the political spectrum than they think. Okay, this is the thing. But instead they've been used as weapons. Okay, they've been weaponized. This is what's happened. They've been weaponized to go and act out against their own citizens, the fellow citizens that comprise of a nation, right? They're doing that. At the same time, they're going out there and acting in a way that the baby boomers describe as being spoiled brats. Well, what were the baby boomers themselves? Were they not spoiled brats? Did they not get everything? So this is why I'm saying, okay, there's a generational schism that's happened as well, because most of the boomer generation don't understand that their own thinking was wrong. Because they were all in favour. It doesn't matter where they fell on the political spectrum, and I'm not talking about every baby boomer. Some of them were decent folk, but that was a very, very small percentage, okay, if you really look at it. But those guys, right, those guys and women, right, that comprise of the baby boomer generation, they have not only contributed to the problem and made it worse, they've exacerbated it, but they have washed their hands of dealing with it because they were very, very individually selfish. Okay, their selfishness brought about the destruction of following generations. Okay, because they didn't care what their kids were being taught in schools. They didn't care whether they were being indoctrinated with socialism or Marxism or communism. They didn't care. They didn't care. They still don't care if people are being indoctrinated with wrong-headed ideas that are extreme from the right wing. Okay, but that's not the real right wing. That's just neoconservatism. Okay, like there's a lot of screwed up stuff happening, and if you pull on one thread, you actually end up pulling on a whole lot of others. Okay, you'll unravel the whole thing. Like one thing touches upon another thing, and so this is part of the reason why when I'm doing these unplugged sort of talks with you, we end up going through a whole array of different subject matters because each one has a bearing on another, you know. But people need to pay attention to the damage that they have done. The older generations I'm talking about here, okay, they need to pay attention to what they've done because this is their creation. This world we're living in now is their creation. The world that we will be living in future is going to be your creation and my creation, okay, and the creation of all these younger people. But we have to give them the tools of communicating why it is that they are angry at the system. Because they are angry at the system, there's no denying that, right? They just don't understand that the system isn't comprised of patriarchy. The system isn't comprised of, and a lot of people will say, what do you mean? You know, people on the left will think, well, wait a minute, surely it is patriarchy that's responsible for all of this. Well, you might be surprised about what's truly at the heart of these problems if you were to properly look at it. Because there is no such thing as patriarchy, as many people have debunked, okay? In actuality, what you'll find is that certain people who have acted with only their own individual interests in mind, okay, certain people who have a sort of socially Darwinistic worldview, who don't believe in giving other people an opportunity after they've had an opportunity themselves, have created these problems. Okay, and a lot of those people purport to believe in the ideals of socialism or communism to further their own goals, not to actually do anything for the mass populace. Okay, not to do anything for young people. Right? The leaders who orchestrate a lot of these movements, if young people were to look at that, they would see that they are not trying to do anything that would better the lot of these students or whoever else. Okay? And students are getting trapped in these debt bubbles. That's another thing, right? It's not that this is like, I know I'm explaining this a heck of a lot, but it's not that they're wrong in saying that they feel oppressed. What's oppressing them? Is it people? Is it their fellow people that are oppressing them? No, it's the system itself. Okay, because it is a debt-based, funny money system that is leading them into all kinds of financial woes. It is a very decayed system in terms of the conceptual frameworks that they're being given through these damaged educational establishments. So they have no concept of moral right or wrong. They don't understand that their actions are going to have an impact on their own lives. They don't understand anything whatsoever about what they're doing, the effects that their own actions are going to have, and so on. Okay, they don't understand that using the state as a tool, as a means to violently enforce their own ideas is the very definition of tyranny. Okay, the things that they're advocating for, they don't understand. That's the weird thing. In their minds, they honestly don't get it. That what they're advocating for is exactly what they are weirdly against. It's contradictory, but this is what's going on in their heads because they were given the wrong language tools to describe their own predicaments. It's not a case of oppressor and oppressed. Okay, it's a case of something else entirely, which is enslavement versus being free. Okay, that's the real dichotomy: enslavement versus being a free person. Not, I'm being oppressed. No, the notion of oppression, okay, is bollocks precisely because you can't oppress somebody that knows their inherent natural rights. You cannot oppress somebody that knows that they have an inherent worth and value. Can't be done. You can throw that person in jail, but all you will have done is to incarcerate their physical body. You can't damage their spirit or get to their inner mind. You can't give up ideals of freedom. Can't happen. That's another reason why Marxist theory is garbage. But as I say, it is fatalistic. Okay? And fatalism is flawed in and of itself because of the reasons that Hume presented, because of the reasons that we're coming to find out now in the relatively new arena of quantum mechanics as well, right? So I touched on some of these things in the previous video. This was the reason for it. You have to understand what's going on, okay? And until people start doing that, until they start reading again, okay, because this is another thing that's lacking in society today, people won't read. If people don't read, how are you going to, if they don't read the books from which these political philosophies come from, how are you going to know anything? There's plenty of people that will harp on about the evils of communism or socialism, but they've never read Das Kapital. Okay, so they don't understand what the opposing side, if you want to call it that. These dichotomies are artificially created, but let's say, you want to term it, you want to categorize it as the opposing side. They don't understand what people who have different beliefs to them believe. Okay, it's the same thing with Islamism and Islam. If you want to understand it, if you want to rail against it, you have to go study the damn thing. Okay, this is one of the main reasons why the West is failing to stand up to the totalitarianism of Islam today. It's because they've never read the Quran, they've never read the Hadith, they don't know anything about what those people believe. okay, or the interpreted slant, from all these publications, from all these Islamic scholars from Al-Azhar University, let's say. If you're not informed of any of that stuff, right, all you're doing is offering an opinion. And that is useless in the war of ideas. Why is it a war of ideas? It's a war of ideas not because the people themselves, okay, and I'm talking about the general populace here, not because they've chosen to be at war with anybody. Okay, although a lot of them have kind of got this slave mentality where they've become warmongers themselves, but that's a different thing. It's not a question of the populace declaring war. It's a question of having somebody else, okay, declare war upon you, okay, by initiating acts of aggression and violence, say in the case of the state, right, the government. That's what they do on a daily basis. Small example of that in the UK would be the TV license. Okay, that's just a tiny example. They can throw you in jail if you don't pay that. It's very draconian. Another example of that over in the States is taxation. Okay, the IRS is actually a private institution. But they can force people at gunpoint to pay taxes towards the Fed because your taxes don't actually go towards government. Like, it's a really weird sort of system over there. But you can get thrown in jail for not paying your taxes at the end of a gun. There have been people, worse than that, there have been people that have been shot to death in the United States of America for not paying their taxes. Okay, there are people that have been killed in jail for not paying their taxes. I mean, like, crazy things are happening, right? This is the thing. This is the main crux of it. So I guess I will end it on this point. I know I said I was going to end it on another point, but I'll end it on this point. And this seems to happen frequently with my videos, doesn't it? I get started on one thing and I end up God knows where. But the real fight here is against enslavement of your mind, okay, and your spirit. It is not, it is not to go out there and wreak havoc on the other side, because all that's going to do is polarize you, and you will end up committing the very acts of atrocity and violence that you are, or you started out being against. Doesn't matter which side you fall into. Okay, if you get caught up in that trap, that's the trap that's been designed for you and your mind anyway, okay? It's a false trap. Do you understand? That's why it's pointless to engage in those kind of things. And the only people that do, by the way, really are ignorant folks. And ignorant folks primarily comprise of the baby boomer generation. That's what I've found. So... But that's just the way the cookie crumbles, I guess. But the final point I would make, just to reiterate, is that communism and socialism are fatalistic. They don't care about the possibility, and this is the key thing. I guess this is the important part of the argument. They don't care about the possibility that somebody might come out of their categories, their category structures, let's say, okay? They don't care that somebody from Group A could end up going into Group B, or that somebody from Group B could end up... So the oppressor can very easily become the oppressed, and the oppressed could very easily become the oppressor. Okay, these two categories and the people within them, okay, the two sets of people, can... change. And this is what people are seeing in the current time, by the way. They are sort of changing. The very people that were supposed to be oppressed according to communist doctrine are the ones today that are the oppressors. So it's a case of having to ask Hans, are we the bad guys? Okay? Anyway, I'll leave it there for this video, but I want to thank you very much for watching. Take good care of yourselves, and God bless every one of you.